Okay, so this is session 5 of the class, the solar certification course. And what we said as part of our schedule here is that we're going to be dealing with chapters 7, 8, and 9. So chapter 7 is designing and installing the array and the inverter. So when we go to size the array, so what I'll try and do here is highlight the issues that I think within these chapters are somewhat confusing or problematic or whatever. And if you do have questions as you're reviewing through this, if you want to just send me an email, jay at solarpvtraining.com, I can try and deal with that. So I'm going to go ahead and get my whiteboard here set up because we're going to do a little bit of math here. Oops. Okay. All right. So hopefully you can see the whiteboard there. And so when we want to go ahead and size an array, so this is one of the very first kind of math issues that we deal with um, when you're sizing an array. And in a lot of folks are going to ask you once they understand that you know a little bit about solar, they're going to say, what size array do I need? How much does it cost? And it's a difficult question to answer because it's almost like saying how much does a house cost? Well, that depends. Is it in San Francisco or is it in Biloxi? Is it 5,000 square feet or is it 1,000 square feet? Is it on the ocean? Is it oceanfront or in a trailer park? So there's a lot of variables that go into it. And for us, the number one variable is really what is the load? What is it that you're wanting to power? How much are you wanting to power? Most people want to go ahead and offset the power 100%. At least that's how we're going to size these things. So when we want to figure out what is the array, what's the size of the array, we would typically say, all right, well, what is your monthly electric bill? And the reason why we take the monthly electric bill is because that's something we can get from the electric company. I need to move this over onto this screen. Okay, so the monthly electric bill. Let's say you look at your electric bill and it turns out that this particular house, a relatively large house, so let's say it's 1420 kilowatt hours per month. Okay. So we got that just off the electric bill. And usually they're going to give you 12 months worth of readings and they're going to give you an average number. Well, we want to get to your daily load. So we're going to divide this by 30.5. And that's 30.5 days per month, right? So month cancels out and it's going to give you kilowatt hours per day. So let me grab my thing here, and it's going to be 1420 divided by 30.5, and that's going to be 46.56. So 46.56 kilowatt hours per day. All right. So then the next thing we need to know is how many hours of insolation do you have each day? So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and bring up PV watts here. Try again. Can't find it. That's not good. All right. So now I'm going to stop this. Let's see. Yeah. All right. So that's the whiteboard. If I want to share, but I got to figure out how to use this thing first. I'm gonna, I guess I've got to close the whiteboard totally. Huh. For some reason, it's not bringing up my screen. Oh, there it is. That's why. Apologize for that. I just need to figure out how to use a computer. Alrighty. Okay, so you should see the PV watts. So what we're doing here is we're taking it, and let's say that this particular house that we're designing this for is in Boston. So you can type in the zip code, you can just type in whatever the name, and it's going to then take you to Boston. And if you want to just verify that you're at the right place, there's a little bit of a map here that just shows you're in the right place. And now we're going to figure out how many hours of insulation is available at that particular location. The first thing that comes up is system size. We don't necessarily care about the size of the system at the moment. In fact, that's what we're trying to figure out. So we can ignore that. Then the module type, it says standard, premium, or thin film. 9 times out of 10, just leave it standard. The fixed, well, fixed open rack or fixed roof mount. If it's a roof mounted system, go ahead and select that. We don't necessarily have to worry about system losses at the moment. We'll figure that out here. Well, but let's look at it right now, I guess. So what are the losses? Because this is how you're going to be derating your system. Well, the first one it says is soiling. That soiling is just dust, pollen, things of that nature that accumulate on the panel over time. 2% seems like a lot, so I'm going to change that to 1. Now, shading is based on your location. If there's no trees around, if there's no shading issues at all, we'll set that to 0. Snow, well, Boston gets snow. I could put a number there or I could ignore it. Mismatched panels. So if you're hooking everything together in a string with a string inverter, you're going to get mismatched panels. Panels are going to be like plus or minus 2%, plus or minus 3%. If it's plus or minus and they're hooked together in a string, you're always going to get the lowest common denominator. So if it's plus or minus 2%, then it's really minus 2% because one panel that's minus 2% is going to drag everything in the string down. But because this is on a roof and we're going to have some sort of rapid shutdown device like an optimizer or a microinverter, well, we're going to levelize that because each panel is going to operate independently of every other panel. So if it's plus or minus 2%, one's going to operate at 2% better, the other's going to be 2% worse. So they're always going to average out to about 0. So we can throw that one down to 0. Wiring, well, this is voltage drop. And voltage drop, figure about 2%. We can change that. We did that in a previous lesson. We can modify that and we can get that to 2% just by putting in bigger wire, shortening the distance, increasing the voltage, those kind of things. Connections, well, you're going to lose some due to connections. Every connection is going to have a little bit of a loss due to resistance. So you can leave that at 0.5%. Light induced degradation, lid. Lid is like, I always think of it like you're losing the new car smell, or as soon as you drive the car off the lot, it devalues. As soon as you put your solar panels out into the light, they're going to have a certain amount of loss. It's just going to happen. The light changes it. It only happens once, but it's going to happen. So you could leave that at 1.5% if you want. Nameplate rating, again, that's a plus or minus kind of thing. I'm going to put that at 0. And then availability, well, aging, you could say every year we're going to lose like 0.5%. So 0.5. Because as these things get older, they do lose some of their productivity. It's just the way it works. And then availability. I don't usually like to put a number in availability. That's just assuming that there will be times throughout the year where your system isn't working. I don't like to plan on that. So let's just go ahead and put a zero in there. So that case, it's 5.5% degraded, not counting the inverter. So they don't put the inverter here. So that's kind of how you would derate your system. Now we're going to figure out the tilt and the angle. So how would you figure out the tilt or the angle of the array? Well, it's a roof mounted system, so whatever the roof is what that's going to be. And when you go out there and do your site assessment, you're going to hopefully have measured that. Or somebody might say it's a 412 pitch roof or it's a 612 pitch roof. Well, there's a table in the book in chapter 6 that will show you how to convert that. But let's say that we've measured it and it's 24 degrees. And then you're going to need to figure out its azimuth, or what is the orientation of the building. Once again, you can use a design tool that utilizes Google Earth, which will get you that, or you can measure it on the site. 180 is south, solar south. 0 is solar north. 90 is solar east, and 270 is solar west. So that's how you would figure that. Let's say 180, that'd be perfectly facing south. Let's say it's not quite facing south perfectly, it's 167. Once you've plugged in all of those numbers, you just click that arrow, and now it's going to tell you how much sunlight is available at that location. The number we're worried about here is the 4.75. So it's telling me that on average in that location, with all of those orientation factors, we're going to get 4.75 hours of insolation at that location. So we jump back into our whiteboard here, and I just found out we've got 4.75 hours per day of perfect 1,000 watt per square meter sunlight. Okay, notice hours per day cancel out. And now I'm going to take 46.56 divided by 4.75, and we get 9.8 kW. 9.8 kW. So if our solar array were 100% efficient, we would get we would need a 9.8 kW array. But we know that our system isn't 100% efficient. We just figured it out. It's 5.5% inefficient in addition to whatever the inverter's inefficiency is. So let's say we looked at the inverter and the inverter is 2% inefficient. So it's 98% efficient. So that would be 7.5% inefficient, or 92.5%, or if we decimalize it, it's 0.925 efficiency. So we're basically, this is the D rate. Okay, so I take 9.8 divided by 0.925, and I get 10.6. So I need a 10.6 kW array. All right, so that's how you figure out the size of the array that you need. You basically take the daily load, which is right here, daily load, divide it by the hours of sunlight at that location, given that orientation. You get the size of the array if it were 100% efficient, then derate it for inefficiencies. That's going to be different depending on each site. Eventually, you'll get a feel for that, but and you'll just plug in a number. Maybe you plug in 92.5% efficiency. Maybe it's 90% efficiency. Who knows? And then you get your number, 10.6 kW. All right. Does that part make sense so far? I'll look for your feedback there. Okay. So now the question is, what size inverter do we need? Because we have to size our inverter. So now that we figured out our array, so let's say that I want to go out and um, I'm going to go ahead and let's see. Yeah, that's showing me my screen there. So now I want to go shopping for inverters. So I'm going to put in a 10 kW inverter. All right. So here, US Solar Supplier. I'm just randomly grabbing one of these. So it's going to tell me a bunch of inverters here. And if I wanted to get a 10 kW inverter, it's going to cost 2700 or 2700 bucks. So 10 kW, it's a 10.6 kW array. That might be fine. It may turn out I don't need that big of an inverter. So let's see what size inverters they have. Hopefully, it'll give me more options here. Not that familiar with this website. It's no, it doesn't want to go back, huh? We'll go products, inverters, string inverters. All right, so we've got a 10 kW. This is a 12.5. Those are bigger than we need, 22.5. This little Fronius Primo is 3.8, 5, 5, 6, 7.7. So 2,300 bucks for a 7.7. Notice the 2,300 may not be all that different than the $2,700 for the 10 kW. There's a big difference. 3.8, much cheaper, but 3.8 is going to be too cheap. So looking at these prices, I would be tempted. I could go with the 7.7, and I'll show you that in clipping here in a minute. But the price difference between a 7.7 and a 10 is just not that great. But let's say that I jump into my whiteboard. So I've got a 10.6 kW array, but if I went ahead and bought the 7.7 kW inverter, divide that by 10.6, and that's going to give me a clipping ratio or an inverter load ratio of 1.38. 1.38 um, inverter load ratio. So what exactly do we mean with clipping? So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this. So what is the concept of clipping? Well, if I use a microinverter, it's a little easier to understand. But if this is the, let's say that I've got a 350 watt solar panel. So during the day on a cloudless day, you're going to get a perfect bell curve. That's actually a pretty good bell curve. All right. So this would be solar noon, not 12 p.m., but solar noon when the sun is highest in the sky. And if it was a 350 watt panel, this would be 350 watts. So you build up the amount of power that's generated, you hit solar noon on a perfect STC day. So we're saying it's 75 degrees Celsius, or sorry, 25 degrees Celsius. 1,000 watts per square meter, and 1.5 atmospheres. So that's a perfect solar noon day, a perfect STC day. Now, what happens if I put a microinverter that only has a capacity of 300 watts? So here's my inverter, and this is 300 watts. So what ends up happening is once that inverter reaches 300 watts, once the panel is producing 300 watts, it can't produce any more. So this is simply clipped off. So you lose that amount of power each day on a perfect day. But what if I then put in a 300-watt solar panel rather than a 350 just to avoid that clipping? Well, my curve is going to look something more like this. And I am not going to capture this if I put the smaller panel in. So this amount of power will be lost by having the bigger panel. Even though I'm clipping off this bit, I'm generating this much more power because I have a bigger panel. And because of the cost differential between solar panels and inverters, it turns out that an inverter load ratio of like 1.3 to 1.4 is generally going to be the most economical ratio that we're going to be dealing with, solely because panels are a lot cheaper than inverters. Now, as we just saw in this demonstration, the difference between a 10 kW Fronius and a 7.7 kW Fronius is so small that I would probably, instead of, let's say this was my 10 kW, and this would be a 7.7 kW if I had my inverter and I'd be clipping. Or I could go ahead and get a 10 kW. Well, 10 kW, you get the benefit of those shoulders, but you also then don't clip off anything anyway. So that's kind of the best of both worlds, given the economics that we found on this website, is I'd go with the bigger inverter. You never get into a problem. But let's say that the 7.7 was $2,000 and the 10 was $3,000. Well, then you'd probably be better off going with the 7.7. You'd get a better cost efficiency, better value for money. So that's the whole concept behind clipping. Okay, so hopefully that part of it makes sense. Sizing the array, you take your daily load demand, divide it by the hours of insolation, and then derate it for the inefficiency of the system. How do you select your inverter? Well, you do it based on the size of the array. It doesn't have to be exactly the same as the size of the array, but it's based on the size of the array. This is for a grid-tied system, and then you would figure out what size inverter would be best given the clipping, the inverter load ratio, and the pricing, and all of those kind of things. All right. So then we start talking about, okay, we've identified our inverter. Well, let me share the screen. There's a couple of inverter specs that we need to look at. So what is one? We've decided we're getting the 10 kW Primo, and I need to know what is its startup voltage and what is its maximum. All right, so we already factored in the percentage loss. I said it was a 98%. It looks like it's going to be closer to 96%. So we might have to derate a little bit more there. But at this moment, I want to see what is the maximum input voltage. And so this is 1,000 volts. And, oh, this is basically a commercial model. Okay, well, it'll work. We just are not allowed to go over 600 volts because it's residential. So what is its minimum? So we know its maximum is going to be 1,000, but we're not going to be allowed to use that. because we're installing this on a residential. So let's go ahead and zoom in on this data sheet, and we're going to see, okay, um, it's the Primo 10, and it says the nominal, we can use 240 up to 800 volts. So we're still going to be dealing with 600 volts. And its startup voltage, the DC startup voltage is 80 volts. So I know that the maximum, because it's residential, is going to be 600. Even though the machine can handle more than that, I'm not allowed to go over that because of the National Electrical Code. National Electrical Code says only 600, but the minimum is going to be 80. So we had to search around a little bit there. So I've looked through that spec sheet. Now I'm going to go back to my whiteboard. And I'll go ahead and trash that. Okay, so all right, so now I need to know what is the string, how many panels in a string. So if we're putting in a string system, what is the maximum and what is the minimum? Well, I know that my voltage startup uh, for the inverter is 80 volts to 600. Now, I'd also have to look at the spec sheet of the solar panel to find out how much voltage it generates at VOC. So let's say that VOC, I'm not going to share the screen, but I'll just look at a solar panel so I can um, get some real numbers. So I'm looking at a Jinko 400 watt solar panel. If I pull up the spec sheet and product documents, there we are. And it's going to tell me, there we are. Yep. So I said it was a 400 watt. Yep. So 400 watt. So the VMP is 40. VMP equals 40.16 volts. And the VOC is 49.1 volts. And now I need to know what is the temperature coefficient. And there it is. So the temperature coefficient at VOC is 0.29% per degree Celsius. And at Pmax, 0.35% per degree Celsius. All right, so these are the specs that I needed to know. And now I will also need to know what is the coldest temperature ever experienced at that location. So we said this was Boston. We'd look it up on the internet. Let's say that we decide it's minus 39 degrees Celsius. Okay, so now we need to know what is the delta between the coldest temperature and standard test conditions. So standard test conditions is 25 degrees Celsius. So minus 39 to positive 25 is going to be 64. It's a delta of 64 degrees Celsius. For every degree Celsius, and we're going to use VOC because we want to do the worst case voltage because we're not wanting to exceed 600. So I'm going to use this. So for every degree Celsius, that panel is going to produce 0.29% or more voltage per degree. So I'm going to multiply this times 0.29% per degree Celsius. And now 64 times 0.29 gives me 18.56. So 18.56% more volts on the coldest day ever, assuming that it's sunny. More than what? More than VOC. So 49.1 volts is the theoretical maximum voltage times 118.56%. So it's 100% plus the 18.56% more. Or if we decimalize it, it's 1.1856. And we get 49.1 times 1.1856 gives me 58.21. So 58.21 volts. So on the coldest day ever, that panel is going to produce 58.21 volts. I'm not allowed to exceed 600. So I take 600 volts, divide it by 58.21 volts, and I get divided by 58.21, I get 10.3. So 10.3 panels max. Well, you can't put part of a panel, so we're going to round that down. So it's going to be 10 max. So 10 panels in a string maximum based on all of these numbers. So that's how you would calculate the maximum number of panels in a string. It's pretty complicated, but that's the process. Fortunately, we don't do this very often anymore because we're mostly using microinverters or optimizers. But this is the process that you would follow if you needed to figure out what's the max. So what's the minimum? Well, the minimum startup voltage is 80 volts. And now we're going to take what's the hottest temperature ever experienced. So in this case, let's say the hottest temperature is 35 degrees Celsius. 25 is standard test conditions. So there's a delta of 10 degrees Celsius. But because it's hotter on a roof than on the, than ambient air temperature, the heating and air conditioning guys have said for rooftop, we add 35 degrees Celsius. For ballasted systems, we add 30. And for ground mounted systems, we add 25. So we're going to add 35 degrees Celsius. And now we've got a delta of 45 degrees Celsius. We now take the temperature coefficient at VMP because now we're dealing with real world, not theoretical maximum. So 45 degrees Celsius times 0.35% per degree Celsius. And that's going to say 45 times 0.35, 15.75. So what that's telling me is on the hottest day ever, that panel is going to produce 15.75% less voltage than it otherwise would under standard test conditions. Less than what? VMP. So I'm going to start with 40.16 times, and I'll take 100% minus 15.75, which would be 84.25% or 0.8425. I multiply this 40.16 times 0.8425, 33.83. 33.83 volts on the hottest day. Well, how many panels do we need in a string to make sure it's generating at least 80 volts? Well, 80 divided by 33.83, and I can just look at that and know we need at least 3 panels minimum. So our string needs to be somewhere between 3 panels minimum and 10 panels maximum, right? If we had decided that our array was, I forget the number, but it was like 10.6 kW, it was 10 something. And these are 400 watt panels. So how many are we needing? It'd be 10,600 divided by 400 gives me 26.5. Well, you can't have part of a panel. So I need to decide, do I want to round up or do I round down? Well, sometimes just how you do this might help determine that. How many panels? Well, each of these strings needs to be even. So 10 is the maximum. What's the largest number that divides into 26.5? Well, if it were 27, if we round up, three strings of nine is going to get us that. So in this case, I would go three strings, nine panels each. And that's how you would size your array. So in this case, it would be a three string array, nine panels in each string. Everything is sized hunky dory. Okay, I know I went through that pretty quickly. Um, that's one of the beauties of recording these. You can go over it as many times as you want. But did you have a question on that? Because I think that right there is some of the most complicated of the math that we deal with. Unfortunately, we don't deal with the string calculations very often. So, any questions? Nope. I'm going to take the silence as either you're asleep or you don't have any question. All
No
right.
question.
So, yeah, no questions. Okay. All right. So when I do say that we don't have to do those very often, the nice thing is because of rapid shutdown, most of the time we're going to be using power optimizers or we're going to be using microinverters on the roof for rooftop systems. How do you size strings for an optimizer? Well, if you're using Solar Edge, for example, on page 206, there's a chart and it just says, oh, for using this particular model, let's say it's the S500, for these different inverters, there's going to be a minimum size of, let's just say we're doing the Solar Edge home wave, minimum of 8, maximum of 25. So you're just looking up in the spec sheet. Same thing with microinverters. So you don't have to do any of those calculations. You just simply look up in the spec sheet and it'll say this is the minimum, this is the maximum. With microinverters, there is no minimum. So you just, what is the maximum? What's the maximum in a string? So that's string calculation. We touched on clipping. So that takes care of chapter 7. And honestly, chapter 7, those calculations there are the ones that a lot of folks struggle with. So if you could look at that, that would be helpful. Chapter 8, we talk about wiring size. We did review that already on one of the previous videos. So rather than go into that, why don't you just go back and look at that? The issues that we have to deal with ampacity ratings. There's how many amps are going to be over it. So we size the wires based on the amperage that of the loads that we're servicing. And then you have to deal with conduit fill. You have to do with exposure to sunlight. So there are some D rates on that. In this chapter, we talk a little bit about pulling wire through conduit location, how you deal with those kind of things. We also talk about load side connections, supply side connections. We did touch on that. I think real quick, I'll touch on just to reiterate before we call it a day, the 120% rule. So, what do we mean by the 120% rule within a load side connection? Well, let's say this is your circuit breaker panel box, and this is your main breaker, and you're getting 200 amp service coming in from the utility. And the box itself is rated for 200 amps. Okay, so this just means that this bus bar that goes down the middle where all the breakers are connected to, if it exceeds 200 amps, it might melt just like wire. You know, that's all the power it can handle. It's all the current it can handle. So you might think that this thing is maxed out, that you couldn't use it. to connect your inverter to, because you're going to be bringing more power in from your solar array. But the National Electrical Code says we can go to 120%. So 120% of the bus bar rating, in this case, we could bring in another 40 amps because 120% would be 240. So we could come in with an inverter. It's going to go to an AC disconnect, but then we're going to connect into a double pole breaker, and you want to locate it as far away from the main as possible. So what's the maximum size breaker that could be connected in this scenario? It's going to be 40 amps because that's going to deal with the 120% rule. So then the question is, what size inverter is that? If we're going to the maximum, what's the maximum size inverter? Well, we already have all the information we need to decide that. This is a residential, so we know that it's going to be working at 240 volts. And we know the amps, which is 40 amps. So what is the size of the inverter? Well, logically, you would say 240 volts because watts equals amps times volts times 40 amps. And we would get 4,800, 4,800, is that right? Or 4,600? This is terrible that I can't even remember that. 9,600, 9,600. All right. So we would get 9,600 watts. So you might make the mistake of saying, okay, we can have a 9.6 kW inverter, but that's not right. Why? It's because the National Electrical Code says we always have to have a factor of 1.25 safety margin for the wire size. So maximum of 40 amps doesn't mean you can run 40 amps over it. We would have to take 40 amps, we would divide that by 1.25. That's the safety margin. And that will give us 40 divided by 1.25, 32. So in order to connect to a 40 amp breaker, you can't have more than 32 amps running on that wire because of the safety measure that's margin that's required by the National Electrical Code. So the real amperage is not 40 amps, it's 32 amps. So then we take our 240 volts times 32 amps, and then we get 7,680. All right, watts, which is why when we looked up, we saw a lot of 7.7 kW inverters. They were actually 7.68 kW inverters because this is a common situation. So you would not be allowed to hook more than a 7.7 kW inverter to a load side connection in this scenario. So remember, we went ahead and picked the 10 kW because of price. But if we were looking at our existing electrical, we might have to go with the 7.7 kW just because we couldn't hook anything bigger than that to this load. If we wanted to hook the 10 kW in, we would have to change out this circuit breaker panel. And that might cost anywhere between $2,000 and $10,000. So that would add a lot of cost to our system. So I might be tempted to go with the 7.7. With clipping, we know that we can do it. So this is the way, this is the 120% rule. And that's an important thing to remember. All right. So I think that's a good place to stop. Any questions here before we call it a day?
No, but thank you.
All right. Well, we'll see you guys next week 6. And then let me look at the calendar here because we're starting to approach when we're going to get together in person. We'll get together in person here on the 27th of June in Marietta. So plan that. If you haven't already looked at, are you coming in from out of town, I assume, or are you going to be needing a
Yes.
hotel?
Yeah. So I was gonna ask about that in an email, but yeah, looking for some suggestions. That's all.
Yeah, just, I mean, if I were coming to Marietta, there are two hotels downtown that I would feel like I wanted. I mean, there's all sorts of generic hotels. There's the Motel 6 types, the Days Inn types, all of those. But they're just generic. But there's a couple of really interesting hotels right downtown, right on the river. The
Hmm.
Lafayette is an old Victorian hotel, beautiful old place, right on
Okay.
the confluence of the Ohio River and the Muskingum River. It's literally walking distance to where we're going to be holding the class.
Okay.
I walk there every morning. I mean, when I say walking distance, it's 20-minute walk, but it's a lovely walk. And then there's the Hackett Hotel, which is also downtown. A little more modern, it's a quaint little hotel, but you can look at those two. Those would be my recommendations.
Okay.
Um,
Thank you.
and yeah, I think they may be a little pricier than the other ones, but it's worth it just for the experience. And
Okay.
um, and if you're are you flying in or are you driving in?
Driving.
Oh, okay. So driving's not an issue. Anyone who's flying in, Columbus is going to be your closest airport. It's going to be an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes away, driving. There is a bus that goes from the airport to the Lafayette Hotel, but only runs a couple of times a day. So you could get by without a car, but you'd have to schedule pretty tightly. But that's something that's fun if you've got the time to. I mean, it might be worth an interesting thing not to get the car and just take it's called the Go Bus. Um,
Hmm.
but it literally leaves the John Glenn Airport in Columbus and it will drop you off a block away from the Lafayette Hotel. So it's super convenient. But of course, you might come in at 6 in the evening and there's only one bus out at 10 the next morning or something like, or 10 in the morning. So just check that. I'm not telling you this because I know you're driving in, but anyone else looking at the video. All right. In the meantime, yeah, if there's any questions about that kind of logistics or the like, just send me an email. That said, we'll see you guys next week. All right. Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you.